Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and remind our internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, we would appreciate your last check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, we will post the program on the Heritage website for your future reference as well. Welcoming our guests today and hosting our program is Derek Morgan, who serves as Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy. He oversees several departments in these areas. He is a lawyer by training. He has served in all three branches of the government, including on the senior staff of Vice President Richard Cheney before he came to Heritage. Please join me in welcoming Derek Morgan. Derek?
Thank you, John, and thank you all for being here with us today. In my native Texas, we have a saying for someone who's all talk and no action. We say, that person is all hat and no cattle. Well, today's speaker has a whole herd of cattle behind him, metaphorically speaking, as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. Dave Camp was born and raised in Midland, Michigan, where he and his wife, Nancy, continue to reside with their 3 children. Congressman Camp represents Michigan's 4th Congressional District, which spans 15 counties across mid and northern Michigan. It's definitely far north. It's not quite as far north as my dad's alma mater. He went to Michigan Tech on the UP. That's the far north there. He's been a leader on many issues, including and opposing President Obama's agenda here in the last few years. He's authored very significant Republican alternatives. His alternative to the 2009 stimulus bill would have centered on tax relief to every American family that pays income taxes and incentives to encourage small businesses to grow, hire, and invest. His health care alternative focused on lowering costs, not raising taxes or spending $1 trillion as the health care bill did. He's also known as a free trader, a stance we at Heritage appreciate very much. On trade, he helped to conclude negotiations and passed as chairman 3 job-creating agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. Before his election in 1990, he practiced as an attorney who worked extensively with parents and children in the foster care system. Thank you for all of that great work. His experiences led him to introduce several landmark bills encouraging adoption. He remains one of the House of Representatives' leading adoption and foster care proponents. Most recently, and most important for our discussion today, Chairman Camp set out to systematically analyze and consider our entire tax code from top to bottom. Major tax changes seem to come only about once every generation, and he's had numerous hearings on nearly every aspect of our broken tax system. Many members of Congress have long recognized the problem with the tax code. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the industrialized world, which places our companies at an incredible disadvantage when they compete globally. The tax economists at the OECD called the corporate tax rate the worst tax for economic growth. But Chairman Camp did more than talk by making tough decisions, eliminating many provisions to lower that rate to 25% in his recent bill. One of the many hearings the chairman held looked at the question of why Washington's official scorekeepers should consider the dynamic economic impacts of a tax reform proposal that it would have. Heritage's then director of the Center for Data Analysis, Bill Beach, testified at that hearing. In fact, Heritage for many years has employed its own dynamic analysis of such proposals and encouraged Congress's scorekeepers to follow suit. But Chairman Camp's bill marks the first time it has been employed by the Joint Committee on Taxation on such important legislation. Now that it's done once, it's hard to imagine Congress settling for anything less in the future. This is a monumental step forward for good tax policy, and to a considerable degree, we have Chairman Camp to thank for that. His committee has compiled draft legislation that would lower tax rates, eliminate many deductions and credits, and move to a corporate tax system that's more competitive. The Joint Tax Committee, the Center for Data Analysis here at Heritage, and other modelers found that Chairman Camp's plan would increase economic growth for the next 10 years. Going forward, the discussions about tax policy and tax reform will not be whether they grow the economy, but just how much they positively affect every American in terms of job opportunities, higher incomes, and greater opportunity. Chairman Camp is retiring after this session of Congress, and he could easily be resting after all these accomplishments. Instead, he's working to do something perhaps even more difficult than tax reform: make the IRS transparent, honest, and accountable. Good luck with that. He's also working toward examining expiring tax provisions called the extenders individually. The committee will try to separate the wheat from the chaff among these, determining which lead to growth permanently, to extend those permanently while getting rid of those that do little for anybody except perhaps select companies and their well-paid lobbyists. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Heritage Foundation, Congressman Dave Camp.
Thank you very much. Thank you, really appreciate it. Well, thank you, Derek, very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it's great to be at the Heritage Foundation. Good to see all of you this afternoon. You know, it has been a while since we've had good news about the economy, and just recently we learned that the economy shrunk by 1% in the last quarter of 2014. And it seems not a week goes by that we don't read a story about some business, some American company that's opting to be headquartered outside of the country so they can get a lower tax rate, largely because of our tax laws. And worse yet, real wages, what Americans use to pay the mortgage and send kids to school, real wages declined and are continuing to fall. So, I mean, that really should be a wake-up call that we need policies that work. And clearly, our tax code is not working. Our tax code is a wet blanket on the economy. Businesses are not able to grow, and Americans are not able to see their wages increase. That's why I put out a comprehensive proposal to overhaul the tax code for the first time since 1986. In reality, it would be the first time that we address the international tax system in more than 50 years. What I'm most disappointed in is the lack of response from the White House and Harry Reid. They say they support tax reform, but yet they've done nothing to advance this effort. And frankly, this is just one of the many reasons why we need a Republican Senate next year. Real tax reform needs to be about strengthening the economy and making the code simpler and fairer. And so when I set out to produce a comprehensive bill, I wanted to do it the right way. So we held over 30 public hearings, including the first joint hearings with the Senate on tax policy since World War II. Ranking member Sandy Levin and I formed 11 bipartisan working groups, really to tackle different policies. And in that time, I also launched taxreform.gov, which produced more than 14,000 public comments on the need for and suggestions on how to do tax reform. And I'm proud to say we've done this in the most open, transparent, and bipartisan basis, getting input from all sides. And the debate about needing to do tax reform is over. And at its core, the Tax Reform Act of 2014 is about making the tax code more effective and efficient by getting rid of some of the narrowly drawn and targeted provisions in order to lower tax rates across the board. This will allow small and large businesses alike to expand their operations, hire new workers, increase the workers' benefits, increase their take-home pay. That would certainly be a novel idea, wouldn't it? Now, we flatten the code by reducing rates and collapsing today's brackets into two brackets of 10% and 25% for virtually all taxable income. That ensures that over 99% of all taxpayers face the maximum tax rates of 25% or less. And the plan also reduces the corporate rate to 25%. By making America's tax rate more competitive, we're able to keep companies' headquarters in the United States. And so they can grow, invest, and hire here instead of moving overseas in search of a lower tax rate. Now, we need a real solution to this problem, and I believe a more competitive corporate tax rate is it. This tax reform draft was the first time that the Joint Committee on Taxation, as Derek pointed out, was able to use dynamic scoring for tax legislation. And so we can evaluate the real long-term benefits and overhaul the tax code can bring us. And from that, we're able to see that the analysis of independent economists, which show that tax reform results in stronger economic growth, more jobs, higher wages. And after streamlining the tax code, the independent nonpartisan analysts say that this could actually increase our economy by $3.4 trillion, more than 20%. Based on stronger economic growth, we'll see nearly 2 million jobs created, and there will be about $700 billion in additional federal revenue from growth, not from higher taxes, but from growth that can be used to lower tax rates even further or can be used to reduce our debt. And that kind of growth has been verified by virtually every independent analysis that's examined this bill. And, for example, the Heritage Foundation put out very important economic analysis that shows the growing potential tax reform has for families and businesses. Heritage found that the average American family could see their after-tax income grow by 2.3%, and that GDP could increase by almost 3% as a result of tax reform. And that's the kind of growth America needs. And it's the kind of policies that can produce a stronger, more robust economy. And that's something we need the Senate and the White House to work with us on. Part of doing this bill was to force the debate. And not only about the policies, but also about the analysis. And we know for the first time in my more than 20 years in Washington, we're having a real debate about the kinds of assumptions the Joint Committee on Taxation makes when analyzing a bill. And most recently, we've been laying the groundwork for tax reform by advancing permanent tax policies through the Ways and Means Committee. We need to move away from legislating short-term extensions of tax policy that make it harder for businesses to plan and to move forward and we want to move forward on permanent policies that gives that certainty and stability so that families and businesses, large and small, that utilize those tax benefits can really plan for the future. The House has already voted to make a series of these provisions, like the Research and Development Tax Credit, permanent, and the committee's acted on several others, like the 50% bonus depreciation. And look, regardless of the new leadership in the House, I expect the committee and the House will continue to process permanent tax policy through the Senate. Of course, we have to wait to see if the Senate can produce anything before we start any final negotiations, but let me be clear about those negotiations. I intend to fully make some of these provisions permanent so that businesses and families don't have to wonder year in and year out what parts of the tax code are going to be there and what will encourage investment and economic growth, what items will stay and remain part of the tax code. So we're the only country in the world that has parts of its tax code expire on a regular basis. And we have it expire, it expires for a year, then we retroactively put it in place and then move forward for a year. And that is, there's nobody else who does that, so there's a question, why should we? But if we do have permanent policies, we can have the kind of tax code that encourages the kind of investment America needs and deserves. And so I very much appreciate the chance to be here today and look forward to the questions that you may have. Thanks so much for having me.
And we do have time for some questions. I would just ask, because it's being recorded and broadcast, just ask that you would wait for the microphone and that you would let us know your name and affiliation, and then we can ask questions. If I may take the prerogative and
Sure.
ask the first one.
Absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit about kind of cronyism and government picking winners and losers, and did you do anything to address that in this draft, and how important is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what we were looking for is a pro-growth tax bill that was simpler and fair. And one of the things on the individual side we did was increase the standard deduction so that 95% of taxpayers will not itemize. So this idea that you're engaging in rewarding behavior according to the government is going to be less of an issue under a reformed tax code. Certainly on the business side, with going to lower rates, there are a number of targeted provisions we look at and make changes to. And that, what we heard in the more than 30 hearings that I mentioned we had, was that a lower rate was absolutely critical for our businesses, obviously those within the United States and also those that compete around the world. That in the 80s, we had the lowest corporate rate in the world. Now we have the highest. So we do need to address that issue as well.
Okay, we have up here in the front. Start here.
Hi, Luca Gattonicelli, Tax
Yeah.
Notes, learn more at taxanalyst.org. Mr. Chairman, I was wondering if you could speak a little more about the debate over how the Joint Committee and I guess how other entities even analyze tax policy and generate revenue estimates and do macroeconomic analyses.
Well, what we had in the past, I like to liken it to high school physics, where you go in and they say, first assume there's no gravity. Well, under the old sort of flat scoring, they'd assume that tax policy doesn't change people's behavior. And that no matter what you did, the amount of, labor and investment stayed the same. So if you did something that created jobs, it meant there was less investment. Or if you did something that created more investment, it meant there were fewer jobs. So we know that isn't the reality. So it was very important to get the kinds of assumptions in place and the right kind of economic modeling, and it's something that the committee and the committee staff we've worked on for several years to get in place the ability to use dynamic scoring in this comprehensive draft. That's why it was important to do a detailed draft, so that we could actually get the kind of score that says, if we do these things, our economy gets bigger, more people go to work, and more people make more money. I mean, I think that was really a critical part of that. So, as Derek said in his introduction, going forward, this will be the standard. And that is a huge victory in terms of moving the issues down the field. Clearly, we need tax reform. And as I said, the committee's going to try to move permanent policies from now till the end of the year. But absent that, it was very important that we get the right kind of analysis as we look at what these policies might do. And to think that capital is immobile, which is what the assumption of a flat sort of scoring model does, when we know that in the real world, now more than ever, capital can go any number of places around the world, and that's why what our corporate rate is makes such a huge difference, and what our tax policies are makes such a difference. And we've all seen the press stories. This is an active thing that many American businesses are doing, is for tax purposes being incorporated somewhere else. And that's not a good trend for the United States. It's not a good trend for the people and the families who live and work here. So we need to turn that around, and that's what dynamic scoring helps us do.
This gentleman over here.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Jim Pinkerton with the Rate Coalition, and you've alluded a couple times to America having the highest corporate tax rate in the world. And could you describe a little bit more of the problem we face with corporate tax inversions and how the various proposals, including from your colleague in Michigan, will either help or not help the problem?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a couple of things we need to do, and if you have to pick one thing, it's the rate, because that is where other nations have moved very aggressively to reduce their corporate rates and are attracting business, whether it's Canada or whether it's England or even Mexico is reforming their tax code. So we have a real challenge there in terms of what we're trying to do. 25 ended up being, it is not only the OECD average, but is also the number that most the testimony sort of centered around, that if we could get a corporate rate to 25, it would really make this problem of inversions really less likely to happen. But we also need to reform our international tax laws because we have almost $2 trillion, some estimates more than that, stranded overseas that doesn't come back to the United States. And it ends up not just sitting over there, it gets invested over there. We really need that capital investment here in the U.S. If you look at long-term trend lines, long-term investment in the United States has been declining. And we really need to have that piece come back, because that's how you get the job creation that you need, is you get more investment in the U.S. So we also look at permanent repatriation, which I think is the idea of bringing those dollars that are overseas back to the U.S. on a regular basis without the double tax that they'd face if they do it. We're the only nation in the world, again, that has a worldwide system of the taxation, is what it's typically called. Everyone else has moved to a different system, so we do need to address that as well. But so companies in the meantime are finding ways to affiliate with the most recent iteration of this is affiliating with a company headquartered somewhere else, and then that becomes a dominant company in terms of headquarters, and so then they're under the tax rate of the lowest tax jurisdiction. And that's fundamentally where we are right now. We need to address that because it's happening. As I said, there's a new story every week in the paper about a major U.S. employer making that decision. And that is something we need to reverse and prevent.
We have another one over here. Right down here, in the second row.
Hey, Chairman.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Good to see you. I'm Jay Heflin with the Federal Policy Group. Could the inversion issue prompt Congress to do corporate-only reform?
It could. I think if you do corporate only, you need to do corporate only and not a part of corporate reform, because you just can't pull out, I believe, a partial holiday or a temporary piece. So I think, yes, and the President says he's for corporate reform and says he's for revenue neutral corporate reform, but we haven't seen anything other than statements on that issue. But yes, it could mean that, because this is really a growing problem, and you want to make sure it's done the right way. But if we do it without lowering rates, that isn't going to really address the issue, because what's really driving this is the overall corporate rate. And again, this has been documented in much testimony before the Ways and Means Committee. Many business leaders have been saying this for years, that we must bring our corporate rate more in line with where the rest of the world is. And again, you think of the 80s where there's, I think, a book written called The 7 Fat Years. We had the lowest corporate rate in the world, and obviously some other things going on as well. But clearly, when you look at this lackluster recovery, in fact, a contraction in our economy, and the fact that more young people are living at home with their parents than ever before and not getting out into the world and really pursuing their dreams and starting on their lives as they'd like to live them, that is a tragedy that we need to, a growing economy helps address that.
Shifting gears just one moment toward the personal income tax side.
Yes.
It's been a popular argument among conservatives for a long time that we need to have simplicity.
Right.
Does that argument still hold up, considering the advance in computer-assisted returns now? And is that a compelling argument going forward in your view?
Well, one of the things that I thought was important to do as we looked at tax reform, and the committee agreed with me on this, was I think the average person should be able to fill out their own taxes without computer software or without hiring a CPA. And even with software, you're still in the clutches of the IRS. But if it's a non-itemized return, 95% of Americans would be able to literally take one sheet of paper and their return would be on both sides of that. So that would mean also no record keeping, because if you're doing a standard deduction, you're not going to have to keep for 7 years or to store on your hard drive all those documents. And of course, if any of us had our hard drives recycled, we would not, I think, have the same benefit that the IRS is receiving in terms of, oh, it's lost, there's nothing I can do about it. I think they would come down pretty hard on all of us. So you want to stay out of that. And one of the things we hear from a lot of, I know we're on the individual side, but a lot of businesses file as individuals, is they've come to me and said, and come to the committee and said, we're signing papers and we don't really know what's in it. You know, we're running a business. You know, our mission is to provide a service or to deliver a product. And they're signing a big stack of papers. So I think simplification is a huge piece of what we're trying to do. And that is one way to rein in the IRS.
I saw a hand over here, front row. Second.
Mr. Chairman, Peter Husey, a small business owner and someone who works in the defense business. GAO in 2 reports this year said there's $14.7 billion in fraud in the earned income tax credit and $4.7 billion annually in the child tax credit, followed by a lot of people who were illegally either in the country or overseas, but fraudulently. And yet, you add those two together, you're at $19+ billion, which is a couple $1 billion short of what we spend on the entire strategic nuclear deterrent, which a lot of opponents say we can't afford. What can we do about clawing back that money?
You're right, it's an annual figure. So when you look at the budget window, we're well over $100 billion in what payments that are going to people who don't qualify for them, whether it's fraud or improper payments, whatever moniker you want to put on it, is something that should be addressed. We do address that in the draft. We do change the EITC and make it a credit against payroll taxes, which we believe, and the testimony we received was that that will go a long way toward doing that. We also make reforms on the child tax credit to say that you must include the Social Security number of children. It's hard to believe that's not required now, but we do that. So we do make some progress in terms of doing that, and I think we'd see a big change there. And I asked for years for the IRS, Commissioner Schulman, to make a proposal to me on how we could address the EITC. Never got that. So we did address this in the comprehensive draft because it is important. We need to make sure that people who deserve these programs receive them. Now, one of the unsaid things that's coming is there are a lot of people that are going to be receiving subsidies under the new Obamacare law that will not qualify them, that actually don't qualify for them, so they're going to get the subsidy, and then the payback is going to come when they think they're going to get a refund and they don't get it. That is going to be a major problem as we move forward because, again, people are receiving that subsidy who don't really qualify for it.
We had another question here, and then I'm going to look over here, so I'm not ignoring you completely. First row.
Hi, Ray Hederman, Heritage. Over the back to dynamic scoring, that's been a debate that has been multi-decades old. Should we do it, and can we do it? Now that we've done it, have you heard of any opposition saying we should have gone down this road, the joint tax made a mistake, or is the debate over and dynamic scoring here to stay?
I think dynamic scoring is here to stay. And part of it is that what joint tax did has really been confirmed by independent outside analysts as well. We've had 3 additional, some Heritage's own study, Race University study as well, and they have basically confirmed. Now, there may be a little bit different result, but ultimately they all come down on the fact that if we can do the kind of tax reform like the draft plan shows, we will grow our economy. We will have more jobs, and those people who are working will see their incomes rise. And all of good things come from that. I mean, that means housing prices go up. Value of housing goes up. That means that more charitable contributions are likely, because, big surprise, if you're working and you're earning money, you're more likely to be generous. And when you look at things like charitable, they actually track how good the economy is doing, how well the economy is, not as much tax policy. I mean, tax policy certainly has an effect too, but if you see the sort of trend lines in charitable giving, it really is really driven by the economy. So if we can get a better economy, we can do a lot of, there's a lot of good benefits that come from good, strong economic growth.
All right, anybody from this section? Been looking the other way. Okay, we've got a gentleman here in the front row.
Hello. Hermes from the Occupy Wall Street. I wanted to know what kind of item would you be able to put into practice if you are waiting for the Senate?
While we're waiting for the Senate, what we're doing is taking pieces of what we call extenders, or items that have expired in past years, and we're trying to make those permanent. And if we can make those permanent, we get out of this sort of every 2 years trying to figure out what the tax policy is. Because what both families and individuals and businesses, large and small, they need to plan. They need to think, okay, what are the next 3 to 5 years going to look like? And they need to know that tax policy doesn't get pulled out from under them like a rug every couple of years. So that's really the goal, is to try to find some permanency. Ultimately, they're probably, assuming the Senate is able to act, they've not yet, but if they can, then we'll have a negotiation. And the House will have some recorded votes, and on R&D, it was a pretty big bipartisan vote. I mean, there's a lot of support for that. I think there's a lot of recognition that the economy isn't where it needs to be. And when you look at some of the polling information, people say, I don't like the direction the country's going. But what you're also seeing is people say, I don't think it's going to get any better. And we need to really make sure that the American dream, this idea that the future will be better, the future will be better for me, the future will be better for my family or my children, that really takes root again. And if we can get a growing economy, the future will be better. And if people can see that sort of brighter future, they will make the kinds of decisions that then multiply throughout the economy. They'll say, gee, maybe I will add on to my restaurant, or maybe I will hire a couple of summer employees, or maybe I'll buy that new copier, or maybe I'll start a new business, or maybe I'll grow the one I have. And if those are multiplied throughout the economy, we'll see a tremendous benefit. And I think that's why these models are able to show that we're going to get economic growth if we can get a simpler, flatter, fairer tax code.
Wondering if you could speak to the assumptions that you started with in terms of it, any reform being revenue neutral and being distributionally basically not upsetting the apple cart too much, and kind of what your thinking behind that was, and whether you think that's really necessary in tax reform.
Well, one of the first things I did was had a hearing and brought in former Secretary of the Treasury James Baker III, as well as former Democrat House Leader Dick Gephardt. And they both testified that in order to get this done, you really need to do it in a revenue neutral way. And the reason is if you start off with raising revenue, that will be the object, and you won't get the reform that you really need to see. And so since they both they didn't talk to each other beforehand, but they both came in and said the same thing, I thought that was probably pretty good advice to try to follow. And then the other thing on distribution and neutrality, I just wanted to get us really debating the policies of, dynamic scoring and the kinds of policies we were doing in the bill, and not defaulting to sort of the tried old arguments of, you're going to raise taxes on the poor and cut taxes for the rich. I just wanted to get out of that sort of rhetoric and move forward on, and have the kind of debate our nation needs to have. You know, what should our tax code look like? Do we really want to be a nation of growth and opportunity, and how would we best do that? And I think that has generally worked. It's generally been, a lot of attention to the policies and not the fallback to some of these easy things to say, because, again, according to joint tax, it is revenue and distributionally neutral. I mean, actually, it's revenue positive in a growth sense, but not in terms of a static sense.
Yeah, after dynamic scoring, it actually would increase the revenues, like you said, that you
Yeah.
could use to lower rates.
You could lower rates or pay down debt, depending on what you decided to do.
This gentleman here in the.
Leon.
back.
Good to see you again, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, good to see you.
Sorry you're leaving in this term, but given that housing policy is so central to a lot of our tax code, or the tax code is so central to
Yeah.
our housing policy issues, how do you see tax reform impacting something as important as, say, the low-income housing tax credit or mortgage interest deduction?
Well, obviously, we had a lot of discussion and hearings on that, and we also did some polling and talked to people around the country, and what we found is for a lower rate in a simpler code, people were willing to make trade-offs or adjustments. They weren't necessarily willing to eliminate things. So one of the things we did with housing is, because we raised the standard deduction, 95% of people don't itemize. So what the home mortgage deduction is doesn't matter in the sense that it does when, a third of Americans are itemizing. So it makes a big difference there. And obviously, if we can get a growing economy, housing prices go up. We have a stronger housing economy. More people are working, more people can afford houses, more people buy houses, and then housing prices go up. So you get the good kind of economic activity that you need to see. We did a lot of work on low-income housing tax credit. We did reform that in the draft and did it in a way that we think will actually get more bang for the buck. We're obviously hearing from it is a draft, so there's still a lot of discussion, a lot of comment coming in, and we're continuing to, certainly take all that in. But the object was just to try to do this the right way and not do it the wrong way. But these are things that we look at. And, do you want a lower rate for your entire life, or do you want to keep? And I think some of the question came to, do you like things the way they are? Should we keep things just the way they are? And one of the reasons it was important to do a comprehensive draft is you get beyond one or two items, you sort of get a look at, gee, how does this whole package look? And what in a sense, with a lower rate and a change, am I better off? And people are making that kind of analysis, and that's been helpful, both business side and individual side.
I know we've got votes coming up fairly
Sure.
soon, so we should probably just have a few more questions. Congressman, we'll go to this back section first row.
Hi, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kevin Dyer-Rotner from the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah.
You suggested simplifying the tax code, lowering the corporate tax, essentially imposing reforms to grow the American economy. I was wondering if you've heard of a different proposal. I'm sure you've heard of it, but I wonder if you have any opinion on it or have scored it. The fair tax, which essentially abolishes all these other taxes and institutes a national sales tax. Advocates suggest that the rate should be around 27% for the national sales tax to ensure revenue neutrality. But in the dynamic sense, I would assume that it would grow the economy and probably increase revenue. So I was wondering if you had any comments on the proposal itself, and if you have any ability to dynamically score it.
Yes, I'm very aware of the fair tax, and obviously I'm the first chairman to ever hold a hearing on the fair tax. So I said, this is a clean slate, and any proposal that is scored, the committee will certainly look at. I have not asked for a score on the fair tax, but I think that's the issue that needs to happen is, how will it impact various income categories, and what will it mean? And but it obviously there's a number of people that are behind it and support it. But that I think is an area where we do have to get the numbers. I mean, it's a plan is. I wanted to get past a plan. I wanted to get to specifics. I mean, we did hear in the last campaign 999 is a great plan. Well, it doesn't really add up, and when you go to all the details of it. So we're going to have to make sure we have that on fair. But I've not asked for that, but certainly some of the support. And Congressman John Linder, who is a big advocate, is a former member of the Ways and Means Committee, and obviously, makes very certain that I'm very aware of his points of view, even though he's not in Congress.
I saw another hand in that section, back
Yeah.
row, and then we'll do one more after that, and then we'll let you go vote.
Kara Jones from Town Hall Media. Just on Friday, the world's largest medical technology company, Medtronic, announced its plans to move its headquarters from the U.S. to Dublin, Ireland, where the corporate tax rate is just 12.5%. My question is, how effective do you think that this tax code overhaul would be in encouraging American companies to reverse these decisions of inversion when 12.5% is still significantly lower than 25%?
That is a testimony that we've gotten from most business leaders, that if they can get to 25, the incentive to move over there just becomes a lot less. It's not as worth it. But this is exactly the issue that we have to deal with. And we're hearing about them and other companies in the last few weeks. And there's a lot of analysts and advisors that are urging companies to find partners to do this with. So it is a very serious issue. But I do think that if we can get to 25, which I said is the average of the OECD nations, I think we go a long way to making that less attractive. And that is something we need to do. And obviously in the international side, we do some changes in terms of what we call the carrot and stick approach to intellectual property and intangibles, and come up with a 15% rate so that wherever that is located, whether that's in the U.S., there's a carrot of keeping that in the U.S. at a 15% rate. And then overseas, you would pay, a 15% rate depending on the jurisdiction you're in. So that actually makes some of the reasons much easier. So when you look at the draft as a whole, there are a number of areas where we make some progress on that issue, but those are the two key ones. But that's what we're trying to do.
All right.
Thanks.
Yep. Do we have one last question for the Congressman? Chairman?
All right.
All right, back here and then.
David Weiser at CPA.
Yeah.
I'm actually from Texas, and I see a new corporation pop up every single day. And there's many states in the U.S., such as Detroit and California, that are suffering from these corporations just moving within the United States. What can we really do to the tax structure to help these states keep corporations within themselves and not lose out on the jobs that are transferring over?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of issues with states, and actually we have a new governor in Michigan who I think we went from one of the least likely states to see business development to number 4 just by part of it is the length of the regulatory process. Does a company have to go to several different places to find how to get around many of the state rules and regulations, or sort of one-stop shopping where they can call and somebody actually really tries to facilitate either their moving in or their expansion or their creation. And so I think part of it is what kind of state laws do you have? And what is your state tax burden? I mean, that makes a big difference even within the United States. So, I think what you have to do is aggressively look at that. And I know a lot of legislatures are. Some aren't, and you're not seeing as much growth in those states that aren't. And others have paid quite close attention to that, and you're seeing some activity there. So we're, states are trying to do that. And obviously, there's a number of factors, but I mean, clearly tax policy matters. We know that from a dynamic score, but you know it intuitively. But now we have proof, and we can document it. So that's the same thing for states.
Mr. Chairman, thank you
Thanks.
so much for
Thanks a
being
lot.
here.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you. Thanks, Barry. Appreciate it.